So, bonjour, Indenawamaganaduk. So, greetings, my relatives. Wapshkie o Goodchild anang indigenous cause. Waba anung indigenous cause. Musto dem bigtagong nishnabig donjaba, kitagon zibi donjaba. So I said, greetings, my relatives, and then I introduced myself in my traditional greeting, which is my name, and my name comes from the stars, and I come from the stars. Those are my ancestors, and that's part of our Anishinaabe Ojibwe cosmology. And so what I wanted to share with you is a little bit about my name, and I actually have two names that come to me. And in Anishinaabe spirituality, we believe that we are actually spirit beings on a human journey for just a short amount of time. So we come from the spirit world, and then we return on the Milky Way back to the spirit world. And so you saw that, so it was beautiful to see so many things that I could relate to. This is my first Red Sky performance, so it was pretty breathtaking. And the first name that I was given, Wapshkie o Goodchild anung. And Wapshkie means white in English, white coming from the north, Giwednung, the North Star. And we actually talk about our four sacred or four cardinal directions as stars. We say, when we offer tobacco to the four directions, we say Sema, Nabagdana, Giwednung to the north, and then Wabunung to the east, and Zhaonung to the south, and Ningiganung to the west. And it's interesting that those are stars. And so my first spirit name, Wapshkie, white from the north, Ogichida Quens. Ogichida means a warrior person. It's the healers, it's the warriors that fight for our people and our way of life. And then Ogichida Quens, Kwe is woman, but Quens is young. And then Anung, star. So one of my spirit names is white, young, star, warrior, woman. Yeah. And my other name is actually Wabu Anung, which is the east star, the east direction, the morning star. And so the North Star is our star that doesn't move, right? But the east is where all new things happen. And it's interesting that I'm in the field that I'm in because I'm actually in the business of creating new knowledge. And I do that through a process of bringing together Anishinaabe, what we say Indamoin and Gikindasowin. So our worldview and our knowledge system. And when we bring those together, we do it in a good way because we're often bringing it together with Western worldviews and Western knowledge. And so we do that through a process that we call two-eyed seeing. And two-eyed seeing is the gift of multiple perspectives. And what's beautiful when you watch something like Trace and when you hear some of our legends and some of our stories is we ask people, and this is a teaching by some Mi'kmaq elders, they say, Etuamumk in Mi'kmaq. And it's the late Verdina Marshall and Albert Marshall from Eskasoni First Nation in Nova Scotia. They talk about two-eyed seeing, and it's the perspective of looking through one eye and honoring the strengths of the Western world, for example, science might be, because I work with a lot of scientists. And the other eye, you're looking with the strengths and honoring the teachings of Anishinaabe, or indigenous knowledge systems. And the example I give to help people understand that is the teachings of the thunder beings, Inimike Benese, the thunderbird. And when we say Inimike Benese, people, we can understand the scientific explanation. When the thunders come back, we know that there's cool air coming from, and warm air coming from one direction, and cool air from another, and we can understand the thunder and lightning. But then when we talk about the thunder beings and the thunderbirds, the Western mind, we tend to want to think of that very rationally and very logically and say, so when the Anishinaabe or the Haudenosaunee or the Blackfoot or the Lakota, when they talk about thunder beings and the thunderbirds, are they really talking about beings that live in the sky? And the gift of multiple perspectives in two-eyed seeing is that you're able to hold multiple truths, and you're able to understand that we do have thunder beings, And we do have a scientific explanation for thunder and lightning. But thunder and lightning is very sacred in our culture. And we have people who listen for the first thunder to come back to our territory because we know that that's a time to change. We know that that's spring coming. We're moving out of one season into another. And we actually have 13 moons, 13 months, and essentially 13 seasons. And there's 13 parts of a turtle's back. So when we teach people about the moons, when we teach people about our time and our concept of time and our calendar, we also bring in star knowledge. And so our star knowledge is kept in wampum belts. The Abenaki people look after the wampum belts, and they have star lodge ceremonies. And so there's quite a bit of understanding of the stars, and we have knowledge keepers that have that really deep knowledge from the stars. And what Sandra mentioned is that I work with NASA, which is, and people usually say NASA. So the National Aeronautical Space Agency in the United States. And what I do with NASA is I bring together their scientists with Native American knowledge keepers. And to give you an example of what we did recently, we wanted to meet with Native American people who look at climate change and who look at needing real-time information about their land. And so we brought together the geospatial folks, all the satellites that are up in the sky. And it provides real-time imagery. And there's a Dr. Carletta Chief, who's a Navajo hydrologist, uses that real-time imagery to look at the drought that's affecting the Navajo Nation. But anyway, NASA said, we want to get together. Should we get together in D.C., right, Washington? And I said, no, I don't think we should get together in D.C. I think we should go to a Native American reservation, and because the elders are there, the knowledge keepers are there, the language keepers are there. We're not going to fly them all to D.C. And NASA said, okay, we can do that. And for the first time in the history of NASA, they had a meeting on a reservation. We went to Red Cliff Reservation. Thank you. Yeah, that was a big step for them. We went to Red Cliff Reservation in Wisconsin, and they have a national park. They're on the shores of Lake Superior. It's a very sacred area near Bad River, Wisconsin. It's part of our migration story, the Médée story of the Anishinaabe. And people often ask me about those words, reconciliation, decolonization, indigenization. And what I usually answer is that it starts with our language. Anishinaabe-mawin. Anishinaabe-win is our culture. Anishinaabe-mawin is our language. And I'm not a fluent speaker. My dad went to residential school, Spanish residential school, and my mom went to Roman Catholic Indian Day School in Kitigan-Zibi, which is Garden River First Nation. And my dad's from Pick River. And so he was sent to Spanish, and he spoke Anishinaabe-mawin fluently. And my grandma Bella Mendewagan never spoke a word of English. But as a child, I was taught English, and then I was taught French in school. And so I've had to go back and reclaim Anishinaabe-mawin. But what's interesting is the linguistics behind it. So what I study and what I work on is something called systems thinking and complexity theory. And I think Anishinaabe, we're natural systems thinkers because of the structure of our language. And so in a lot of indigenous languages, from the Coast Salish to the Lakota, Blackfoot, Anishinaabe, Mi'kmaq, we don't have a lot of verbs. It's a very, we have a lot of verbs. It's not a noun-based language. English is very noun-based. We say star, and we think of, or sun, or moon, we think of it as an it, right? It's a noun. But we say Nokamisgizis, right? We say grandfather or grandmother, Nimishamisgizis, and Nokamisdabikgizis. So when we say son, we say Nimishomisgizis. That's my grandfather, the sun. The moon is my grandmother, Nokamisdabikgizis. And they're both stars. They're both Anungs. And when we say Mother Earth, and we say Skakimakwe, we think that it's not a noun. And so it's really easy for us to reconcile that everything has a spirit. A tree, water, the stars, the sun, the moon, the planets. ISHPIMING means the above world, and that refers to what Trace, I think, was about. There were some beautiful moments when I saw the stars and I saw the constellations, because we're taught about that. And what it is in Dinawamaganaduk is all my relations, my relatives. And so I saw clans, in the stars. And I'm Moose Clan, and we have lots of different clans. And I'll just share a couple of quick things here. So when I talk about systems thinking, it's really about perspective. It's about the interconnected web of life. It's about how things are related to each other. And when I say we have a language of verbs, when you have a noun, when you have a chair and a table, it doesn't tell you much about the relationship between the chair and the table. But when you have a verb-based language, when you have descriptions of places that are quite elaborate, so we don't have place names, like we wouldn't say back home, I wouldn't just say Garden River. I would start explaining things in Anishinaabe. I would talk about the tree that's beside the river that turns quickly near the blueberry patch. And then it would be a big, long name, right? So when you're walking with the elders, they don't map the same way that we think of maps, and they don't talk the same way about the land. So I was with an elder in Sartlip First Nation, which is on Vancouver Island. His name's Talaktin. And Talaktin is Blackfish clan. He's Orca clan. And my tattoos are getting kind of well known because they've been photographed and featured on TVO. I have here two orcas, which are my spirit helpers, a male and a female orca. A female orca from the north and a male orca from the south, who have traveled with me as my helpers my whole life. And then there's Saturn, Earth, and the moon, which I think sadly turned out looking more like a chocolate chip cookie, but that is the moon there, and stars. And that is in relation to my spirit names, because my spirit names came to me from two orcas, the orca in the north and the orca in the south. And in our cosmology, orcas are one of the representatives of our ancestors on Earth. They're the star people on Earth. Remember that movie, Star Trek? When Star Trek 4, any Trekkies in the room? I think it was Star Trek 4, when they had to go back in time and get George and Gracie, the whales, because there was a probe coming through, destroying planets, and nobody could answer the language, and it was the language of the whales. And so, it's fascinating that whales take on accents. Have you ever heard that orcas and humpback whales, they sound like they have an Aussie accent when they're near Australia, and they sound like a Canadian when they're up in our waters. And so there's a real relationship. So Talaktin, who's Blackfish, he said to me one day, I'm going to take you to the ocean and we're going to look at wildlife. And I thought, so in my mind, I started picturing seals and orcas and maybe some grizzlies and some eagles. I was very excited. And then we walked down on the shoreline and we were by the rocks, and he took me over to a puddle about this big, maybe a foot big. And he said, come down here. And so we got down on our knees and we looked. And I thought, well, what's he showing me a puddle for? I was all ready to see wildlife. And he moves a rock. And there's a tiny little crab. They're called sea crabs. They're about the size of your baby fingernail. And I thought, whoa. And this little crab ran over there and he went back under another rock. There are all kinds of little fish. And he says, look at all the wildlife. I thought, yes. It's a question of perspective and scale. And I thought wildlife was only at my scale. And that's what anthropocentric thinking does. We think about things in human terms. We think about them in our own time scale and our own space. And it didn't occur to me that wildlife, you could have a whole world in a little tidal pool. And so I'm always learning about that from the elders. And so that's what I do. I try to bring our knowledge together from the elders and bring it into the complexity theory. So complexity theory looks at systems and all of the relationships between things, and it helps us understand paradoxical implications. So in other words, if you change something over here, if I change something at a scale that affected whether or not that tidal pool exists, we've seen the extinction of mass amounts of species, There's actually a tiny frog that went extinct in South America because with global warming, they only mate in tiny little pools like that. And high up in the mountains, those pools dried up. And we've lost forever those little frogs. And so I always think about that little tidal pool and that tiny little crab I met. And that tiny little crab is one of my greatest teachers. And when I wrote a paper last year about social ecological sustainability, I'll spare you the details, but it was all very sciencey. It was all about the ecological services that the earth provides for us. What do the stars do? And that's what we do in ecological economics. How much value, monetary value, do the stars give us? Does this plant give us? Does this animal provide for us? And I was feeling that was very foreign to me. And so I texted an elder back home. I have about 4 or 5 elders on their phones. Some of them are on flip phones, but they still text me back. And then one of my elders, my brother back home, got a smartphone, and now he's sending me all these gifts and things. But anyway, I always text them for language. How would we say this? Right? I remember one time sitting in a room at the Banff Center, and everybody kept talking about the environment, and I thought, I've never heard an elder say environment. And then they were talking about the land, and I know we have, aki is the land, but how would we say environment or nature? I've never heard that. So I texted an elder back home in Manitou Rapids, and he says, we don't have a word for nature. We don't have a word for environment. He says, we say, gedakiminan, gedakiminan. I said, what does that mean? He says, it means everything in creation. The moon, the stars, the sun, the wind, the animals, the plants, and your sacred place within creation, and your sacred responsibility to look after creation. And that's all in one word. It's called a hollow phrase. Linguists call that a hollow phrase when you have a whole bunch of teachings in one word. And I thought, that's it. That's where the answers to some of our most complex problems, our intractable problems, the ones we get stuck in, we call them feedback loops and system archetypes. Traps, right? We look for simple solutions to really complex problems. We're kind of programmed to do that because we have funding deadlines and people need to get reelected and we need to see results. And so we say, this is our answer to homelessness. This is our answer to climate change. And what I like to explore, and our language helps me do that, is more complexity, understanding the dynamics between and the relationships. And I think our star knowledge helps us do that, and so does our language. So I'll wrap up by saying that one of the things that I try to introduce to my colleagues, whether it's at NASA, I work with a number of different organizations. I've worked with the Toronto Arts Council here in Toronto, is to introduce people to the theory through art. And I think that's what Trace did for us tonight. I find that if you use a point of entry that's universal, and especially when I work with elders, because I do systems mapping with elders. We just did it in 6 Nations last week. We were mapping traditional foods. We went out in the cornfield, we went out on the land, we learned about the corn, and then I did it in Lilwat Nation in BC a few weeks ago, and they wanted to map in their language. And so two-eyed seeing allows us to bring this different type of knowledge together, and I think Trace gave us all, because I saw, and my husband was elbowing me, I could see the top of the teepee, and the flames go up, and I thought, yep, he's a fire keeper. And our traditional burials, we sit in that teepee for 4 days while we get ready to bury the person we've lost. And I've looked up at that beautiful site, and it's home to me. When I can see the stars through the top of a teepee and yet see the flames come from the fire, that just melted my heart when I saw that in Trace. So thank you, Miigwech, Sandra, for the invitation to be here, and thank you for the opportunity to talk to you tonight.
Thank you. Maybe what we'll do is we'll take a couple of questions and then we'll call it a fabulous night, shall we? Yes, over here. Do you want to, will we get feedback if we do this?
All right. Thank you. You're obviously a big believer in climate change. As I am, I can't believe that there are people in this world that don't believe the scientists, because it is real. I believe it's real. But this does not really, it's not really about what you've spoken about. In reading that most horrifying, sad letter in Trace, where do you start with forgiveness, is my question. Really.
So I do quite a bit of work with Reconciliation Canada, and with I taught a systems-based leadership course this summer at Royal Roads University, and we sprung their leadership challenge on about these 20 students that were expecting kind of like a mini executive MBA program, and it was reconciliation and decolonization. And we brought in guest speakers, and there was a residential school survivor. And so out of the 20 students, 16 were not Indigenous, 4 were Indigenous, 1 was a residential school survivor. And we were just talking about this today. I was working with a group where there was someone who was very angry. And so people are at, I think, a different point in their healing journey. And for some of us, we've had the opportunity through ceremony and through working with our healers, our teachers back home in the lodge. My husband and I are helpers in the lodge. And, you know, like the loss of my language is something I could definitely be very angry about, very upset. And then you read that, and I still have family members and elders and grandparents who lived through a different time before residential school, who lived on the land and remember what life was like, could have been like 1,000 years ago. And I think about all of the ways that as a younger person, I could remember that and hold on to that and resist all of those things that were done. Because my grandparents went into hiding in the community. They actually practiced our ceremonies out in the bush where the Indian agent couldn't find them, because the Indian agent in my 2 reserves would take children away if they caught you practicing your ceremonies. And so I think, you know, just speaking for myself, but also working with a lot of people, there's on both sides a lot of emotion. We call it trauma-informed. You know, you can trigger somebody with something quite simple, a sound, a smell, a piece of music, and all of a sudden the room gets pretty awkward, pretty tense when you start talking about reconciliation, especially in this country where our education system didn't teach us that, right? As average Canadians, it's what Gord Downey, you know, yelled as his concert, and his dream was that people would start talking about that history. And so I think if we can create spaces where dialogue can happen, and I think the arts is a beautiful way to do that. I think it's a beautiful way to introduce these. Our artists interpret that history so beautifully. But it also has to be trauma-informed. There has to be counselors, elders, people that can help, and we do that in ceremony. I actually do a lot of feasts with people, and I've worked with families, non-Indigenous families, who are dealing with their own unresolved grief or shame. I met a young woman, her parents worked at a residential school, and she remembers as a little girl playing in the hallway. And she's horrified now by what that was, because she was friends with some of the Native children there. And now that she's grown up and knows that history, her parents were like administrators. They worked at a residential school in BC. And she felt so much shame and guilt. And so I talked to her, and we did what we call a letting go ceremony. And it was a beautiful ceremony, and it you know, she needed to do that. And for me to help her was an honor. So I think that's part of it, is that when we work together, because we all have emotions and we all feel things, that's the best way to heal, right? Is maybe to heal together in some, and then other times just stay separate. I really do believe in dialogues where it's just Indigenous people and then others who are just learning, so that you can say all those awkward things and ask all those questions and then come together. So it takes time, and do it on the land. It's really difficult to do it in colonial spaces, university rooms, boardrooms, classrooms. It's better to go sit by the fire and have those conversations.
My voice is pretty loud. What's the Anishinaabe notion or language about human-to-human romantic love?
There is, as far as I understand, we do have a word like that expresses that expresses romantic love, but it doesn't. Like I've been taught it, I don't remember because I don't ever really say that very much. And I think it's partly because, I have a partner and can express that, but it's usually done in other ways. And I'm actually thinking about ceremony. So my partner, my husband, is in the audience here. Nice looking guy in the suit back there with the long braid that's down to here. He's Algonquin, and when we go to ceremony, there's a balance. Remember I talked about grandfather, sun, and grandmother moon, and the men in Anishinaabe culture is our fire keepers, and the women are the water keepers. We're responsible for Nibe. So my auntie Josephine Van Damen, walks around the Great Lakes and talks, and my little niece Autumn talks about the water being alive. But there's a teaching in that too. It's a teaching of balance. Too much of one dampens the other, right? Too much water will put out the fire, too much fire will evaporate the water, and you need both. And there's a teaching in there about respect. And it's interesting because we ride Harley Davidsons, and so in an alter ego of both of ours is, we're bikers. And one time he brought me a plate of food, and a biker dude bugged him about, giving your wife food, and and he just looked at this biker dude at a rally and said, "Look at my beautiful wife. Of course I'm going to bring her breakfast." And that was it. The guy just didn't know what to say. But what it is the teaching of when you're in our ceremonies, you will see those teachings, and the men really look after the women. Because the women have a lot of ceremonial power. That's why men have sweat lodges. A long time ago, women didn't really go into sweat lodges. We had other ceremonies and other ways of cleansing ourselves. And so it's interesting that you get those teachings in the language and in the teachings of the moon and the stars. And when he's a fire keeper, that means he starts the fire when he starts the sacred fires, and he looks after them for 4 days. And then we look after the water, and then we feast together. And so there is romantic love, but there's also this sense of being a team, and that you need that balance. And the elders actually back home tell us, because I carry a pawagan. When I was 19, I was asked if I would accept the responsibility of being a pipe carrier for the Anishinaabe by elders in Treaty 3, and I'm 47 now. So since I was 19 years old, I've been learning how to have the capacity to look after a pawagan. And he has a pipe, and he has a thunderbird pipe. Mine is a turtle pipe, and the turtle are the chief of the water spirits, and it's a woman's healing pipe. And so we fast, we go to ceremony, and we do things to learn about that from our ancestors, and we do that together. And so I think our language does capture that. But I don't think we say it that much. Yeah, there's, I'm sure it's like that with all kinds of couples. Love is expressed in, other ways of how you care for and respect somebody. But I would say he's a feminist because he really stands up for that type of respect, and he does it public, not just between us, but. And he's a big tough guy, so nobody really takes him on about anything like that. But it's interesting because when I was sitting on an advisory committee for a human rights organization, and they started talking about gender rights and they started talking about human rights, we don't have a word for that in our language, And so that's why I say our knowledge systems And our teachings are really encoded in our language. The presence of words and the lack of words let you know what that really ancient worldview that we inherited from our ancestors, even though language was one of the first things that was attacked in residential school. Our language keepers kept those teachings, and they're in our songs and our ceremonies. Yeah.
Ready? Hi. Thanks so much for being here. Amazing. I just want to ask a related question. Where do two-spirited people come into play in terms of like the water keeping and the fire keeping?
You know, I was, sorry, that was loud. What I've seen, which I thought was so beautiful, is I met a two-spirited, transgendered person at a ceremony, and she was, at the time, she was changing her name from her female name to a male name, and she was singing songs, and she was keeping the water. And then she says, but I'm transitioning, and what I'd like to be is a fire keeper. But we and the elders considered her, and I've heard this talked about, but we considered her, and she's now a him, and in that process, and got his name legally changed. So he's a he. And he's now can be a fire keeper, but he knows the woman songs, and he's a beautiful singer. And we thought that was an amazing gift to have those gifts from both genders, or from multiple genders, because we had multiple genders, I've been told by the elders. And so what colonization did when it brought different value systems, I think some of our communities, because when I grew up, there was homophobia in our communities, and there probably still is homophobia. And so when I was about 21, I started doing workshops on being an ally, and I started to do workshops on gay rights in Thunder Bay. This was a long time ago, and on anti-racism and things like that. And it was really a new discussion. This was after the AIDS crisis, and this was when, and there was a beautiful friend of mine, he's passed away, Tony Nobis, was in Thunder Bay doing work on educating people, because we inherited, I think, from the colonial process, different values, and there was a lot of confusion. What I've been taught in our lodges is that the men and women, how they identify, if they're transgender, sit where they would like in the lodge and take care of things the way they would like. And it's a gift that they bring. So this individual I met him at Trent University. He did water and he did fire, and it was pretty beautiful. So I'm hoping that's how it is for most people in their communities at ceremonies, and especially for the young people that are coming out, that's the environment that they can come out to in our ceremonies for sure, and they'll find love. Miigwech, thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Melanie. Melanie Goodchild, everyone. What a wonderful night, huh? Very fulfilling, and thank you so much for coming out. Chimigwich, everyone, and we'll see you soon. Tell all your friends, and please stay in touch with Red Sky Performance and Canadian Stage as well. Miigwech, thank you.